Hey, this is Tyler T-Jack Survival. A couple seasons ago, I had the opportunity to go up to Canada to the Global Bushcraft Symposium and interview Morris Kochanski. Now, I've been asked recently to upload the entire interview with Morris Kochanski, which I'm going to do because he passed away, and I believe that this interview is the last interview that he did before he passed away. When I interview, I ask a ton of questions because I'm trying to get a story. I'm trying to get something that has a beginning and something that has an ending. And every once in a while I'm having these conversations, we go off down a rabbit hole and then we come back, and I usually delete that out because it's not part of the story. It's not that I don't want the information to be there or that I want to delete it, but it just doesn't make sense in the story. It's always my goal to take every bit of information possible and put it in another video where it matches the topic that we're discussing. But that's not always possible because sometimes I don't have a complete or coherent story with a beginning and with an ending. Now, any of you that have discussed anything with Morris Kochanski realize that he's an extremely deep well of knowledge. He knows a ton of things. And that's a good and a bad thing. When you ask him a question, he'll start here, he'll take you on a journey, and 45 minutes later, he'll end. And it will make sense if you can hang in for that full duration of time and you get these amazing nuggets of wisdom and outdoor survival knowledge if you can watch that whole duration of time. So keep that in mind when you watch this video. You're going to get a lot of information. You're going to hear me talking. You're going to hear him. It's going to be in the raw form. And again, if I was able to create an independent story with the footage that I have, I would have put it together. But it's just overwhelming because it's such a large volume. Hopefully this is interesting to you. Leave any comments you have down below, and thank you for watching.
French is a complex language.
Sinking. 3, 2, 1. That should work. Okay. Okay. So the way this is gonna look is just gonna be you. I'm not, and you'll talk to me, and then I'll get multiple perspectives. So I'll ask you a question. Just take a second to think about it, and then however you want to answer it. That second gives me the ability to edit my talking out of it.
Okay.
So it'll be just you talking about your stuff, and all I'm here for is to keep it on track. So essentially we're going to cover who you are, where you learned from, where you come from, where you learned, how other people can learn. And then I have already filmed with Larry Olsen. I've already filmed with Dave Westcott, Dave Holiday, some of these other guys. And if you can, in the end, I'll ask you, how did you meet Larry? The story where you wrote him and he never come back, that'd be great. You know, because I have him talking about that. Anything you got about Holiday? If you want to mention, if you remember Cody Lindine's first course, like any of that stuff. Okay, so let's start out with who you are.
I am Morris Kochanski. I was born in Saskatchewan, Canada in 1940. At the beginning of the, it's sort of those days where the war was going on, the Second World War. My parents had immigrated 2 years earlier, and thereby my father missed a great deal of the situation going on in Europe by having moved his family to Canada. And my father was in the Polish Army, and he felt that things were escalating, and he figured it would be a good idea to get to Canada. He investigated the issue of bringing his family over, and he liked what he saw. My father was a forest person, and that is, it meant that the situation of the forest people is they like to have access to the forest, which means fishing, hunting, mushrooming, burying, berries. So for example, we picked mushrooms by the 5-gallon pailful when they grew, and by the time I was in school in grade 1, I knew 20 mushrooms. I didn't know their names, but I knew which mushrooms my parents wanted to pick, and it was very easy later on in life to pick. So, well, matter of fact, if I want to throw names around, people occasionally say, what's the difference between you and Raymond Mears? And I would often say, well, probably I had Polish parents. And I knew my mushrooms by the time I was in the elementary school. So that had a boost of, we lived in an isolated situation. farming. My father was, a carpenter, log house builder, and so he brought the money in, and my oldest brother ran the farms. So the local people really didn't have the benefit of having someone bring in money, so we always had, maybe initially we had worn out machinery, but very quickly we bought everything brand new, whether it's a combine or that, so we were quite prosperous. We lived out in the country about 10 miles, which takes 10 minutes to drive by car, but I had an older brother, had to room and board to go to high school for the fact there was no busing to just the 10 miles. And he continued on. Well, my older brother became an orthopedic surgeon, for example. We're all, my father was illiterate, but all his kids were highly educated. Now, if I got to blow my own horn, I just received an honorary degree for the work I do in college. So anyway, and that, if I try to instigate something like that, I depend on others who I've impressed where they give me that. I'm also an honorary Canadian Ranger because of the work that I've done over the years, and somebody in the system, took the time to set that up. But anyway, I was brought up in a farm setting, and my father in Saskatchewan, grade 8 and elementary school. There's no schooling in between, so it's grade 8 is up to elementary school, and grade 9 to grade 12 is high school. Well, there happened to be a scout troop in the basement of the country school, and the three of us discovered this, and we essentially became our own scout troop, devouring all the knowledge, even teaching each other learning semaphore, the flags were there, so that knots, staffs, on and on, whatever scouting is. There was never manuals, but there were pamphlets, and that sort of knowledge that the three of us added to our knowledge through the scout material has stood me in good stead for the rest of my life in the issue of all those subjects that scouts would have to learn. But when we moved to the city, I saw the opportunity to join a scout troop, but I found that they were, I was a farm boy. I harness horses, I drive a combine, I have my own tractor, and people are playing floor hockey with a grommet and a stick. That didn't turn me on. And I sort of said, I joined to actually get a higher level of knots and things. That wasn't happening, so I got very disenchanted, but it took a year. And then I thought, well, in Canada we have the cadet movement, so if you're an elementary, grade 8 up to grade 12, you can join the Sea Cadets, Air Cadets, Army Cadets. We wear the same uniform, and so if you're in Air Cadets, then you essentially do in the summers what a regular airman. So by the time you maybe work in the cadet movement, by the time you've been in it 4 years, probably the very first year, what you would acquire in training is accomplished. So that's the way the Canadian and the Commonwealth of England, they did that because besides scouts, the cadet movement would prepare the cadet, and then they could join the Army or Air Force or Navy, and they already would be trained to the extent that by the time they graduated at grade 12. Well, anyway, I joined the Sea Cadets, and it took me to the Pacific coast and the Atlantic coast, and I absolutely loved it. So I got accepted to military college, but it was beyond my capability. Well, there's other long stories, but I got my honorable discharge in the second year, and that didn't hurt me any that I spent 2 years in the military college. But anyway, my background was, I had decided somewhere in high school that I wanted to become a writer. So of course I investigated and tried to say, well, if I want to become a writer, what do I do about it? Well, grammar and you know, language arts and all that. I always perked up and said I need this to be good at writing and so on. So the consequence was that I collected. Well, first of all, it took a while. First of all, I was quite impressed with the type of information that the scouting manuals provided. So you got a manual. It's got stars and plants and knots and camping and first aid. That's all in the manual of a good soldier. If you're a farm boy and you became a scout, you know, the city boys were good at street fighting and not getting, you know, but everything else, the city boys were a bit deficient compared to the farm boys or the kids that were in scouting. They take care of themselves, you might say. But anyway, I spent some time trying to decide what to write as a specialty. And actually, when I wrote to the various magazines for the information on what they like to see, the best paying magazines were True Romance and that sort of magazine, because they couldn't get enough authors to fill their magazines. So the standard went down in that. But I figured I should take university courses that related to psychology, sociology, you know, all that sort of stuff. But in reality, I gravitated towards wilderness skills. Well, actually, it's a funny story. There was cartoon comic characters, Huey, Louie, and Dewey, and they, when they went camping, if they ran across a problem, they referred to the woodchuck manual. And at first I thought, oh, that might exist. But it was pointed out to me that it was a figment of the imagination. And then I thought, well, as I investigated a little bit, I thought that's a great idea. I began collecting the information that I figured would be appropriate to put in the woodchuck manual. Of course, I would realize now that if I used the title, the Woodchuck Manual, probably Walt Disney would say that that's a proprietary name. So I probably can't use that title, but I could, you know, on the fly. So I began to study diagrams, pictures, and I didn't realize that people could instruct in survival till I drove by the gate of the Department of National Defense RCAF Survival School, where near where I live. I was employed as a provincial welfare officer, and my duties took me past the gate into a remote community. And when I drove by for the first time, I got very curious. It said survival school. School means teaching, and but I was too intimidated. I guess too many people would drive down that. I would get the feeling if I drove in there, they might just shoot me. No trespassing. You know, there are probably about 3 no trespassing signs as you would progress. So I was intimidated, and after a while, curious in the closest town, I'd ask about the school, and everybody knew it was there, but they didn't know much about it. And then until I saw somebody wearing, you know, the olive drab uniform of a soldier, and when I thought, you know, as I got closer, I could see that he had epaulet on the epaulet. He had civilian survival instructor. Oh, here's someone that works at that facility. That was Tom Roycroft. He had been working at that at the survival school for 18 years when I met him, and we actually talked and talked and talked. I recall it was close to 6 hours, as you can imagine. We stood on the street corner talking, and he was so starved to talk to somebody that showed any interest. The other people that worked with him were totally, they're not scholars. They were really. Tom was very keen to you know, further his knowledge, and his guru actually has a relative, Brenda, older, she's Kelly is like a great uncle or whatever, so she's related to Kelly. And of course, marrying a guy like Dave Holder is kind of a small world, and that there's the connection between Tom, who's Kelly was his guru, and Tom was my guru, and that stuff. Well, what it means when I say guru, Tom, generally I had collected every book I could lay my hands on wilderness skills and survival and camping. You know, the common books. I was so familiar that if I talked to you, I pretty soon knew what books you had by what you said. Well, when I met Tom, I found the phenomenon that I couldn't place him. That as far as I knew, he didn't have those books because he was so involved in, I'd say he didn't need to learn from books because his livelihood allowed him to make a living directly in the forest. And if you had the right ideas and attitude, you developed your own. You didn't have to copy from other people and adopt, a favorite author or whatever. So anyway, he was instrumental. I don't see it here. The Roycroft ski shoe is probably creates the biggest impact in that he developed the idea to use long, slender sticks.
They're right behind you, Joe.
Oh, yeah, you got to bring it.
Do you want water?
Oh, that'd be great. I got some back there.
Okay. And just start over with, this is the ski shoe or something that I can cut into.
Okay, this is called the Roycroft ski shoe.
Can you say it one more time?
This is the Roycroft ski shoe. There are many imitators, but I directly learned from the man who developed this idea. So the situation is that when someone says we need a snowshoe, in the imagination of the person, they see a native snowshoe that has a wooden rim and it's got, rawhide as the webbing and so on. Well, if you attempt to imitate a native snowshoe, even a native person has to be skilled in making such a snowshoe. And the result was that if you tried to tie two sticks together at this end, spread it, and then use paracord, it took about 20 steps and you had a tangle of stick and paracord on your ankle. But if you lashed there's a wide variety. This would have been for a person with a small stature, and you would use maybe, if at most, 2 arm spans of string to build the ski shoe, rather than hundreds of feet to create webbing. And so you gather the sticks. If you go up and down hills a lot, you usually don't peel the bark off because the unpeeled stick will grip the snow better. And then you tie the toe, and then you balance the bundle of sticks until you get a perfect balance. And the attachment has to be, about the length of your shoe forward of the balance point. So that means that when you lift your foot, the toe comes up. And maybe if you curl the toes up sometimes, if you're in deeper snow, you just slide forward. So instead of taking distinct steps, like with regular snowshoes, you can shuffle, which might help. But anyway, Tom developed the concept, and then I took off. As I always say, a good instructor teaches you all they know, and a student has the opportunity to learn from the master and go further beyond what the master taught you. They call this the Canadian. Well, it was developed by Tom and no one else. So they should. Tom would call it the Roycroft snowshoe. I would. And other people, Tom might call it the Canadian snowshoe, but you know that there's a protocol that if you're the instigator, you have to have someone else recognize it. That it's not sort of like, well, I'm the great person that developed the Roycroft snowshoe. That's kind of presumptuous and arrogant, you might say. But anyway, then there's the pack frame, and there are many other things that should be in the RCAF survival kit manual that never ever, like signal fires and many other things that he developed a unique and more effective way of doing things. So the ski shoe is probably makes the greatest sensation of all in how effective it is when the snow is so deep you need snow. But anyway, I shortly after I met Tom, in a short while, there was the biggest thing going at that time was that the schools were adopting outdoor education to add to the curriculum. And so the government established a school called Blue Lake. The survival school is just a few miles from where the Blue Lake Center was. And so when they established the center, Tom already knew the person who was the director of the center. And so automatically, Tom and I became the survival instructors for whatever they advertised, of which the courses were very popular. Well, the courses, we arranged and we said, always make two classes, one for Tom, one for me. And Tom and I would double up, and I would watch Tom demonstrate and whatever until finally I could give the demonstration. Then I would give my, so we doubled up all the time, so acting like an instructor and co-instructor in a while. And then later, when the courses slowed down, I didn't need to be there because Tom had passed on all that information that was needed in the type of curriculum we made. Well, the center was patronized by the university outdoor programs, which were essentially part of the physical education situation. And there was an error that happened when they assigned outdoor education exclusively to phys ed, physical education. Now the physical education was producing lifeguards, swimming instructors, canoeing instructors, and so on, mainly catering to the needs of summer camps. And then the outdoor ed taking over by the phys ed teachers, they already really preoccupied with tournaments and everything, and they're expected to do a good job teaching kids how to dress, which should be home ec, teaching how to cook camp cooking, that should be home ed, and things like science, the plants, mathematics, navigation, and all that. Any school that chose that way did much better than having the phys ed teacher do all those things. So I saw that was a deficiency in the idea how things go. As far as I know, I don't really know. I have so little to do with the outdoor education movement that I haven't done anything with it probably for 10 years or so. But anyway, the professors that used the center, one of them, when he went on sabbatical, he realized that I was the other side of the coin. He was the swimming instructor, or the sports, the outdoor type, the canoeing and so on, and the singing around the campfire, and But I knew how to light fires. I knew how to use an axe skillfully. I knew how to sharpen knives. So everything he didn't know, I essentially fit the bill. And everything he knew, I essentially knew little about. The songs around the campfire and so on. So when he had that sabbatical, first thought he had, he said, would you like to take my place for a year? And like I almost fainted because I couldn't understand what I heard. He was talking to me on the phone. He says, how would you like to take my place on campus? And I said, what? Take your place on campus? Yeah. You mean, no, yeah. Well, if I'd set my sights to get into a position to do that without his participation, there's no hope in hell that I would fill a position in any faculty in the campus. But I became, so the more I worked with the people, the more they say, well, that guy knows his stuff, and I never ever took a course. I'd go camping with the scouts for a while, but based on the information I had collected, and I was a surveyor before, years before. For 5 years I was a surveyor. I developed very good axe skills in my work and on the farm and everything. So when I saw Tom lecture on axe safety, it was instantaneous recognition of what the point, the issue was, because up until then, no one ever explained exactly how you take a safe stance and how to not chop yourself in the forehead or make your toes longer or shorter or, all that sort of stuff. So I had no difficulty picking all that stuff up almost instantaneously because I was already a proficient axe user. But anyway, I taught on campus for the university, which gave me, if people wanted to call me professor, I guess I would say that I deserved the term. So for 23 years, and my thought was that when the people that saw that I participated in the university program, if they retired, I expected I was going to retire shortly after. Well, when Dr. Scott, who was instrumental in having me there, when he retired, it took 5 years. And it's a long story about there's 2 universities, and the government is trying to, you're competing against each other for the same students. So shut down one program, and then the university that doesn't shut down now has a quorum of students. And it turned to Calgary. There's no way I was going to move to Calgary. So as I realized that I no longer worked for the university, the school district in northern British Columbia got into a funding situation where they had accumulated a very large fund, and the accountants were like saying, you're not using it, that's proof that you don't deserve it. So the school went into a spending, the school district, there was 40 schools in that district, they went into a spending frenzy. And for a few years, there were about 5 agencies, bear safety, and kayaking and canoeing. They had a huge aquarium that was like a semi truck had to pull that, and you pulled over, you went up the steps and you went there. All those things, of course, cost money, but eventually all these other things, they fell by the wayside, and I was the only one. So for 17 years, the schools utilized my knowledge, and I began to develop a program for kids between kindergarten and grade 6, and I called it the tangible education, the tangible outdoor education program. So essentially, I realized what the kids were deficient in is that they needed to use their hands, and that was the focus. And when you talked about anything to any child between kindergarten, well, even grade 12, but grade 6 predominantly, you had to give them something to keep, whether it's a seashell or a piece of wood or, whatever. And so as you wander through the forest, that you encounter things. So if you see the evidence of beaver, the beaver chips, well, the kids tape down the beaver chip and discuss, and then I show them the skull of a beaver, and how the teeth are unbelievably long, and as the beaver uses them, the teeth continue to grow and whatever. And I might have a beaver pelt of which I might pluck some hair. They tape the hair so that on a microscope they could compare every hair that I would pluck and put, and on a microscope you could tell the difference. On and on like that. If you see a pile of sawdust under a tree, it's likely a carpenter ant. Well, what's a carpenter ant? And when you see big chips at the base of the tree, it's obviously a woodpecker that hammers this big hole to grab the carpenter ants with his beak because he doesn't have a tongue. And in the situation that some curious people wonder, how can a woodpecker take the hammer so hard and the big chips that fly off, how does he manage not to damage his brain? So there was a bunch of people that looked into that, and then after a while there was another researcher that
Let's record in. Be close to your microphone.
oh,
It's all right. Sync it. 3, 2, 1. Okay. That should be good. I'm gonna get a little more strength. So, all right. So we are rolling. That was good. Okay.
the issue of the tangible education that I groped for a consistent process. And the issue is that whatever you show the kids, you try to show a useful connection. So it's like the pileated woodpecker hammers such a big hole in a tree to grasp the carpenter ant with its beak, not having a long tongue to fish them out. And the impact of the chips that they knock off, it's not like it's a pretty serious hammering process. Well, anyway, the people who were wondering how they cushioned, the research sort of was, how does the woodpecker do it? But a step further, a person designing the bicycle helmets used that information to be very useful in this, making a bicycle helmet more effective and so on. So there's a lot of that stuff in the forest. One thing I encountered was a fire-killed tree. This tree is very large. It was killed in the fires of the 1890s. So that tree is it grew, so that wood is maybe 400 years old. The tree was killed in the 1890s and it's still standing in the forest. And you see these, they're almost like totem poles. And when you ask the kids, I say, what happened here? This tree was almost burned down. I said there was a fire that affected a live tree to cause this. And they usually say, oh, lightning stroke, Well, you have to explain to them the historical aspect of fires. And some trees, they fall over or you push them over, but they tend to persist in the forest because they have a taproot. And if you can push them over, then you can get gallons of tar from the taproot. It's because it's saturated so tar. Well, your ancestors came across the ocean in sailing ships, and they used that tar to waterproof the hull. And the charcoal that you produced in extracting that tar was used to forge iron so they could make better swords to protect themselves and perhaps, kill the Aboriginals to get them out of the way. And the Aboriginals were unhappy, and so you could string a long story that ties into historical things. So at least they get the ears that the forest fires caught those trees, and they realize what the mechanism that made those trees, and they still persist today in the boreal forest.
That's perfect. Do you want to jump in on this?
Might as well pass me the little axe and the other two and the sheath axe. These are my gurus tools.
Awesome.
Here we have the ultimate Roycroft pack frame. There is pack straps and enough cord to lash any load, whether it's a honcho moose or whatever you're carrying. I didn't use anything until the phenomenon of Value Village and Goodwill, where you could buy pack frames, the second-hand pack frames. So Tom, someone who went to the Korean War, explained to Tom how the farmers would bring produce to market, including a pack frame where you tied a live pig. So you took that pig from the farm and you took it alive, because if you butchered it, no refrigeration, so the people were ultimately going to buy that pig. They had the means to butcher the pig and preserve the results and share with many people. So you had to get the pig by market, and the easiest way. And the prongs that you have here, when you got the pack braid on, clear the ground sufficiently, but not too much, so when you spread your legs, the weight of the pack frame and the burden would be taken up by the prongs. So you're walking along a road, that's not a problem. Walking through the forest. So Tom modified this, and eventually in the RCAF that he worked with, they adopted it for a while, but never got into their manual. And eventually people sort of just, it wasn't developed by someone who was in the military, that he was a civilian laborer and whatever. So after the ski shoe, Tom is renowned for the pack frame. This crossbar is elbow to fingertip long. These are so my version is slightly different, but I thought I borrowed it from his wife, and I thought people would sort of see how he handled it. After all, he developed it, you might say. Now his favorite axe was the one that more or less was issued in the RCAF survival kit. This is called the boy's axe. And it says HB on here, which we thought was Hudson Bay in style. Well, HB as Holsbrook. And the head is, so if you hold the head in your hand and you stick the axe in your armpit, you end up having a match to the bones of your hand. And in some cases in the summer, you would need this axe. They never ever adopted a saw in the RCF survival kit. But Tom found that a little hatchet would be handy for making kindling and stuff, and you could see that it wasn't very big, but it was meant to be used in camping. And he mounted paracord here that you could actually probably have enough to make a pair of ski shoes. And I brought a lot of his artifacts on display. People would be interested in that. And he had made so many walking sticks, but from the time he retired, that his wife said, the house is full of walking sticks in the garage and everywhere else. But when we loaded them up, and she kept what she wanted, like maybe 20 or so for her kids and so on. The remainder were brought here, and there was 160 canes and staffs. So I said, well, bring it here, and that'll be a memento of my guru, the guy who a lot of people know the name Roycroft from the fact that they pack frame and ski shoe.
It's perfect. Do you want to tell me about, can you tell me the story about how you reached out to and then eventually met Larry Olsen?
I was a welfare officer, and I joined 1966 and 1971 in that capacity. And about 2 years before I retired from working as a welfare officer, the welfare department took the probation of juvenile delinquents from the Attorney General's department, and they figured they could do a better job. So they were very receptive to anything that you would do, in the connection of rehabilitating delinquents. And I chose to use camping. I think there was a term that some people were developing. They called it, I think it was, that had the word rehabilitation in there. And they were very receptive that I would take kids camping as a means to get to know them and as a means to work on their problems. I think it was called psychotherapeutic camping is what some people said. So that was an in that I would get 2 days off during the week to take the kids camping so they wouldn't take them out of school. And I worked at that. That helped to get started because, when you do something, if you're paid to do it, then you can put more, if you do it for free or volunteerism, usually that doesn't go far. But if you're being paid to do it, so you're making a living, and you can appropriately put a lot of effort into it. So I developed this program, and I was between Tom, and there's this outdoor education center, and I would take the kids out winter camping. Like for example, take the kids out on the coldest day of the year. Well, you got to get the confidence of the parents because some of them are leery that the kids might not survive this camping episode. But we go camping, and we put up teepees that are heated by wood stoves. I always made polyethylene teepees, and we get by very nicely. The welfare department provided me, covered all the expenses and provided all the food and all that sort of stuff. And so I got to know what the kids were capable of doing. And of course there was a time when there were people in our society that could do a lot of work, working with youth. So when you're working with people, the worst way that you work with them is they come into your office and you're sitting at your desk and they're sitting there and you say, Johnny, how are you? Are you behaving? No, Johnny, would you like to go camping? Well, I'm not so sure. I said, just don't worry about a lot of things. We'll make you comfortable. Will you come camping with me? So they come out. Once they come out, they will never pass the opportunity. And the kids that don't have the chance to come out, they'll say, what? You were out last night, it was 60 below, and you were out there all night in the bush? That's what you actually, so the delinquent, he gets that feedback that he knows something. He's like looked up to because you have done You went up there and you stayed out there at 60 below, and you came home without freezing your fingers, all of that sort of stuff. So when you work with the kids, of course, you have a lot of opportunity to do stuff where, they may look up to you considerably if you can light fire the bow drill. If you throw a piece of paper up and your knife is so sharp and you cut it while it's falling, they respect you because they say, oh, that knife is sharp. Can I learn how to sharpen? Or you might say, and the way I worked with kids, I never ever said, let me show you, because I found it tended to turn them off. So if I wanted to teach them something, I would use a technique where I would make a pipe. I would carve it, and I'm carving, and if they're not paying attention, I eventually carving the pipe, and eventually I'm smoking it. Oh, they didn't realize that's what I was doing. And so making a pipe and collecting the tobacco, the kinnikiniks, they're now asking you, well, if I just said, I'm going to show you, that would retard the process. So you would find that do anything that would attract them, especially making pipes, making tobaccos, and they're the most psychoactive. There's two psychoactive teas that are quite benign, and that's blueberries are very good Technicolor dreams, visions, bunchberry. You become extremely euphoric when you drink the tea, and if under your guidance they realize what you have, so they're learning about the plants. So when you pick a tobacco, a kinnikinik, which is silverweed, and if they're familiar with marijuana, it's about 1/4 the power of marijuana, and they instantly say, oh, I won't go to jail for this, but it's legal. On and on. There's various strategies like that. And so some kids really respond. You don't expect everybody to, but some of them sort of become your acolyte. They come to learn. They enjoy the type of challenges you present to them.
Do you want me to scoot you over? Are you getting sun?
No, it's my buttocks is.
Okay.
I need to shift because it's starting to.
Perfect. So, Larry Olsen, how did you reach
Oh
out
yeah,
to him?
Larry, I got to the work, and I ran across. I don't remember, but somehow, I think it was the Whole Earth catalog, and there was Larry Dean Olsen's book advertised there, Outdoor Living Skills, and they intrigued me. And so I ordered it by mail and discovered that Larry Dean Olsen was involved in a program called the Anasazi program, which essentially probably, I don't know if it was delinquents. And I learned that, so I wrote him and said, I'm into that sort of stuff myself, and I would like to touch base with you. But he never answered my letter that I recall. Subsequently, I discovered every few years, Larry would come out with an improved edition. And things would change, not much. Like the very first book, the illustrator, the line drawings were his, I think, sister. And so it said there, mentioned it. And then, so if you read each edition, there was more information about what he was doing and things like that. So by the time I've got this many different editions that Larry, and before he died, when Randy had him, he autographed a book and said, give it to Morse. But I met him in Rabbitstick, and I was really looking forward to meeting with him and talking about, that Anasazi program. But if you sit down with Larry, and then, in a very short time, he was gone. He'd be gone. I sort of thought, well, did I offend him? Well, yeah, that was Larry. He was the kind of guy that would sit there and get restive or whatever, and he didn't sit very long and want to talk with anybody. Well, finally, he ended up in that Woodsmoke, the inaugural meeting that Dave Westcott and Larry was there, and I sat beside him with all the Titans, and Larry was starting to really get he couldn't run away anymore because he, he had crutches and everything. His wife was there helping to take care of him, and a grandson. I met most of what happened at one of the Rabbitsticks. I discovered that about 3 of Larry's kids showed up. I think he adopted a number of kids, and he had his kids, and the book put them through university. The income he made was sufficient to help them all go to college or university. But when I discovered, his son, who was young and dating, he hasn't married yet, and I found out he was there. We sat and we talked as long, everything I wanted to know about what went on in Larry's life. I could talk, and I was familiar with all of these references in the books. And one time, one son said, "How come you know so much about our family?" And because he was impressed that I seemed to know so much. And I said, "I just simply read the forewords in your father's book, Outdoor Survival Skills." But anyway, finally at Woodsmoke, we sat for hours, and finally my curiosity about a lot of things was fulfilled when we sat down. And one of my friends attended Stuart Goring, and Stuart Goring really impressed him in a variety of ways. Stuart experienced a situation where he had to survive in an airport for a week or so. Something happened where no one could go home, and how he used survival techniques with regard to dealing with the situation. Like for example, the first class passengers got first class treatment, and Stuart wasn't first class, but he joined up with the first class people, so he benefited from that on and on. And how the Russians would steal and hoard things. He knew where to find the stolen mattresses. Anyway, so Larry Dean, I was very impressed, and actually I looked forward to his second book, which he never wrote, because I figured he had a good start. I'm hoping he's going to write another book, but he was only had one book in him, and a lot of information in the book. If you look at my book, Bushcraft, you'd see that if you looked far enough, that information was only found in his book, and so I stole it. And I was but he never ever commented on the fact that these notches and so on I got from the outdoor survival skills book. Now, Dave Westcott, a student of mine, took a winter camping course from Boulder, Outdoor Survival, and his name was Dudley Driscoll, and Dudley took the course, and his training was far more knowledgeable than what went on in the course. And Dudley suggested to Dave he should look, if he's going to run winter skills type courses, see me. And in a short while, Dave shows up, makes arrangements, shows up, and he shows up right at the time when I ran an exceptional course in winter survival. The university programs, you got your basic degree, and then you could come back and spend 4 more months refining your knowledge, and then try to make a living at it. So here I had these students who were spending 3 weeks with me, and they were right into the advanced stuff because they had already taken every course, but the only occasion that type of group specifically hired me to run this course, and David Westcott showed up when that course was in full process. So he saw stuff that was unusual with regard to a lot of things he had never seen. And then after that, I guess I got invited to Rabbitstick, which I think I might have gone probably 4 times. And that's where I met Cody Lundeen, because he came up to me and said, if you need a ride anywhere. So he became my right-hand man with the wheels. And so we gathered materials. We gathered back poplar bark and cattails. I ran programs. And the first time I sort of got a feel for what went on in Rabbitstick. Well, at a certain point I saw these clusters of girls, like they were a little bit, they were all like sort of stuck close together to each other, and they're like, they weren't wearing buckskin. They might be wearing shorts, so I said to the facilitator, I said, who is these girls? Oh, he said they're the Outdoor Ed students from Rexburg. There was a college in Rexburg, and I said, well, they seem to be out of sort, like they don't know what to do with themselves. Napping is going on, but I felt that I was used to the knowledge that type of outdoor education students would appreciate. So I said, hey, schedule me so that they would have a lot of time with me. And then I simply just taught what I used to teach the university courses on campus. And they, when the Rabbitstick is on, you could show up. I've showed up, there's 12 inches of snow, and I show up where it's exceedingly hot, and I discovered that I should go locally and buy enough black plastic to cover my parachute, because it wasn't shady enough. And people were kind of, even under the parachute, they were suffering. So they got to know that that I could teach you more if you're sitting under the shade of a black plastic than the parachute, which would sort of you're overheating, you might say. So I appreciated that. Many times I discovered that black plastic gives you a great deal of relief from the stress of the too much sun.
Do you remember when you first met Cody? Do you remember him coming up and doing a course with you?
Well, I met Cody, and probably after the second, maybe after the second Rabbitstick, somewhere in there. So I would have to, let's see, I try to think back. Anyway, at some point, he arrived.
I know he trained up here.
What's that?
I know that he trained here.
Well, he spent 3 or so weeks with me, and he examined all my files, and because he was quite interested in the title of my files, and we met Tom, and we visited Tom, and actually Tom was big on the term survival is body temperature, either 98.6 or 30. That's where Cody got his name for his book. Tom's insight. So if you conduct yourself so the temperature does not vary from 98.6, you're going to survive. So that he chose that title. But we wandered around, and I would have to stop and think. That would probably, well, it was well before he wrote 98.6. And I should have brought 98.6 to show.
I can show can show a picture of it.
Yeah, well, I wrote a glowing analysis of what the book does, as opposed to Knowles saying that they would never support such a sexist. They really were, well, you can edit this out, but really tight-assed and stupid by what they said.
Yep.
Whereas Cody's
I'm gonna pause it anyway. Give me 1 second.
Cody wrote, it still is probably one of the most. When was that? What era was that?
Thinking 3, 2, 1. You've talked about Westcott. You've talked about Olsen. You've talked about Cody. If you want to, is there? I guess I'm wrapping up essentially. Do you want to talk about the first time you met Holiday, or? Well, I've filmed with these other guys, and I can take what they say about you and put it together.
Yeah. Well, Holiday has an extremely favorable impression of me. So I don't know how that sort of develops, but so when I would go to Rabbitstick, but then I had a demeanor of trying to be a bit humble and trying to be and a veteran outdoor educator, already many years of teaching under my belt and so on. So anybody would ask me a question, I would probably have lots to say about whatever needs to be said. And Halliday claims that he was really impressed initially, and so when he had the opportunity, and it just happened he could spend all day with me, and I was essentially repeating classes, but I never said the same thing twice, because I had enough. You can only do so much, so you sort of have a little bit of an emphasis. Next time you make the presentation, change it slightly. So generally we're always catering to people. We always tell people that you have to take the same course over 3 times, and if a guy like me varies it a bit, you benefit from that, because they will say, well, what's basic, what's advanced, what's medium, and the only way that you can, you only half heard what you did in the previous lecture, and you might understand the difference and fill in the other half. And so if the instructor has a large repertoire, you get varied enough that you might have to take 3 lectures, and you discover they're all different, although the same title, if you know what I mean. So, I had this stereotypical issue about things like survival. So in my own neck of the woods, I didn't know, like what does making arrowheads got to do with survival? I'm modern survival, and at Rabbitstick, it's the skill and competency at making an arrowhead or tanning a hide or that sort of stuff, and the situation from my perspective, knots, and I studied knots. The very first book I acquired was an enormous book on knots called the Ashley Book of Knots. When I encountered that book when I was in grade 6, I developed an overwhelming desire to own it. So I go to the library girl at the desk, and I said, I want to buy this book. How do I go about it? And the girl said, we'll order it when it comes. Bring me the money. Essentially it was 2 days' wages. The last year that I worked in the school district, I was making the wages of the principal of the high school. And that was $750 a day. So I can buy 8 knots on a day's wages if I earned that like a year in, year out as a principal. Anyway, the situation is, here I come from a distance. Everything you're hearing is affected by, you're used to what's going on around you, But here is this Canadian from a ways away, and I am a person that makes a living by spouting knowledge and guiding the learner. So, I'm involved in a canoeing expedition. Although I hated canoeing, I knew all the ins and outs, and because the canoeing instructor and me were the two instructors, and we shared one course, I was, whether I liked you or not, I had to be the person that picked up the canoeing instructors at the head of the line, keeping the students from getting into trouble. I pick up the students that are in trouble. So I had to very quickly get very competent in canoe rescues and maneuvering, and of course my credibility would be affected if I wasn't skilled. Well, when you canoe for 23 years, even in spite of the fact maybe you're afraid, and I always figured if I drowned, it was because I was in a canoeing situation, because they're in the early, in the first few years, you don't realize the hazards, how you drown in a log jam, how you, if you're lackadaisical in handling getting near the log jam, and it sucks you under, you're finished. You're going to get caught under the jam, and you're going to drown, and things like that. So there was always this sort of things but I couldn't say I outright hated canoeing, but I had to come, and I had to participate. And there's a term you use when you pick up people who are in trouble, but you lose me at the moment. Well, anyway, so Holiday is talking to a person who's an old dog, knowing what to say to large groups of people to sound not pedantic, but authoritative and knowledgeable. And you've been around long that you don't tell me too many erroneous lies. You don't need to, because sound knowledge can be part of that. And I could light fire with a bow drill, and I specialized in making arrowheads out of quartzite, which anybody can make arrowheads out of flint or obsidian and all that sort of stuff. But that's all we had, and it took a lot of effort on my part to find somebody that would show me how to make arrowheads out of quartzite, which anybody who learns to make arrowheads out of obsidian finds it impossible. You started with something that was so good that you can't back off to make it out of something as crude as quartzite. But the museum people found all kinds of quartzite arrowheads nearby, and they too, in their training, just find it difficult. And they heard I could do it. Well, they took a workshop from me, and they learned how you do it, which not the same technique as splitting a boulder of volcanic glass. Well, anyway, a lot of the things I come from a situation, so everything he hears is kind of either adds to the knowledge he has, but he finds unique perspectives. So that's, I assume, why he's so nice and laudatory and personally that he certainly found it he's like he may be the issue that a fellow instructor is either the best student or the worst student, and a fellow instructor who is humble about their knowledge is not egotistically involved in being better or worse. I hate it when people say, let's pit you against Larry Dean Olsen. And I tell them, I said, we don't do stuff like that. You might think you have good footage, but if you promote that sort of stuff, it doesn't do Larry Dean Olsen or me any good, because we don't really care to pit ourselves against each other. You know what I mean? We come from different universes, so Larry might not do very good in building igloos, and I might not do very good at lateral throwing or whatever, but the situation is sort of there. So I think that I found out that his ancestors come from Canada, and there was a character in a rebellion that occurred in Canada was a close relative, actually, not too far distant. So he's a relative of Louis Riel, who was a Métis, and the Louis Riel eventually was accused of killing, murdering somebody, and actually he didn't, but they still hung him for it, and so on. But and sort of yeah, likewise I found Holiday very exceedingly instructive and knowledgeable, because we weren't, we each knew stuff that was not common to us. We each had our approaches, where I was trying to refine a competency in the area of boreal forest conditions, and probably Holiday was in desert conditions. And I probably not such an emphasis on the Aboriginals, although I found it valuable to incorporate things. But there are way more of the knowledge of his, of the Aboriginal people of his region, and so on.
You want more rungs? I'll get the boys.
It was we didn't have to compete with each other, because we each came from a different direction, and what we could spout would be interesting perspective that might refine what you already know.
So, the last thing that I want to know, because I always get the same question about knives. I always get the same questions about knives. The very last thing, do you want to give your opinions on the characteristics of that a knife should have, or maybe however you want to do that?
Well, the knives. A knife is an important portable tool that helps in many ways. Primarily, perhaps, to help you light fires. And people have no idea what you want in a knife that is designed to meet so the knife is unobtrusive, not very cumbersome, and when people, it took many years for me to come up with the statement. I said a survival knife must be a pry bar that works wood really well, implying that it's strong enough. A pry bar is meant to pry, and in the one spectrum, a pilot hopes to carry a knife on him when he crashes, and he's has to cut himself out of the cockpit. Will the knife stand that type of abuse? So the knife that's indestructible, it's a full tang and thick enough, and as a result you get complaint of some people who don't know, they're interested in knives and they study knives and they see all the other knives, and they don't realize that they have not been schooled in how thick the blade is, so you can't break it. Like that K-bar that was issued to the soldiers in the Second World War. If I hit it like this, it's broken. That's all I had. So a knife that's issued to a soldier in combat, that is a very poor. It was so fragile because the tang narrows down and the guard is on there, and then it goes through the handle, and there at that juncture it was very fragile and vulnerable. But anyway, you realize that the knife that you're carrying is probably primarily working wood, feather sticks, whatever you want. Let's build a ski shoe. Will it peel the stick effectively if you need to? all the things. If you peel a stick, a green stick, in a remarkable short time, like a couple of days, it dries out, and it's half the weight, and it's less noodly. When it dries out, it becomes stiff. You leave the bark on, and it sort of it doesn't have much rigidity. So there is a reason to peel the bark, so you can reduce the so a peeled ski shoe is half the weight of an unpeeled ski shoe. So you can cut down a tree the thickness of your wrist, and that thickness and below, you can virtually build a lean-to like that. Those poles laying there, you can actually cut down those poles. If you can't bend it, then you use a baton. But all you need is a jack pine. You need a pocket knife to cut down things thin enough to make an arch type shelter, which is freestanding, and the easiest way to throw a piece of plastic or a piece of canvas or whatever to create a roof, and on and on. So you find that the neat thing is that the maker of this knife is here, Rod Garcia from Whitefish, Montana. The size of the knife, you would say that this is 4 fingers, but if you had a knife like in Sweden called a Sloyd knife, it would be 2 fingers. And 90% of all you work in survival, that's what you really need. Because if your knife handle is that long, the knife handle starts there. Everything is close to the effort, the heart, everything, and so you end up getting the effect. So most people think they know something about knives, but they don't realize if you use the knife sufficiently long and whatever, if someone, I'm trying to educate you and so on, and pretty soon you would realize what you're looking for, and on and on. So it goes from the size of the knife, its indestructibility, and the variation on the knife is the hole to lash it to a stick, and they use as a sickle, long handle, and you're going to cut the grass to use for insulation. And actually you can do a lot of cutting by having that handle, and in Britain for sure, amongst the Himalayan balsam, as they call it, we call it popcorn plant, and in amongst it, it's nice and green, but you don't see in there the concertina wire they call briar in there. It won't allow you to move unless you chop it up. And having a long handle, you got the speed. And, last thing that I would say, well, let's put a long handle to make it into a spear to stab a bear. And maybe if you've got that problem, I never had the requirement to stab a bear. What makes the knife usable is the configuration allows you to put an exquisite razor's edge on it. And this Scandi grind and the fact of continuous curvature seem to participate in doing that. And the back of the blade is so square and sharp that you can scrape up fine shavings, and it gives me the opportunity to take a metal match rod, and it gives you the strikers that they often accompany the metal match are so inadequate, but this corner, when I strike it, it lights the carpeting on fire or the grass on fire, and it makes people are amazed. Well, they don't realize that the amazement is connected to the fact that those two, and yet when you got the knife sitting there and a knife maker comes and looks at it, don't you think it's kind of heavy? Well, it indicates the questions that they ask just haven't used the knife sufficiently to know what sort of a lighter knife. A lot of people think, when I get to know the students and they bring weird knives, they say, what do you think of this knife? And if I feel that, I don't want to badmouth a paying student, but I say, seriously, you realize that design a knife, I snap it, all I have to do is, put it in a circumstance that give it a jerking, broken off the knife. Well, if you want durability, maybe you shouldn't abuse your knife. But if you're trapped in a cockpit of an airplane, you appreciate the fact that no matter what you do, you're not going to break the thing. And then on top of that, I would purposely go out and abuse. I would hammer the biggest nails I could drive into a board just to see how much I would damage. Well, this micarta situation, you could do that for a lifetime, and people would hardly see that is any damage. And then the plate here was, well, the hole here and the plate here, that's two features that you generally, you're striving to make your knife unique. So the hole there, usually I like 3 holes, and the plate welded on, and the size. I would say I'd use this knife to the extent that, in spite of all of its features, I am not far wrong that if you choose this as a survival knife, that they won't come back and curse me. But I see in some catalogs, I see these weird knives. They are not really, the acid test of a knife: carve a netting needle and a shuttle in the netting needle in 5 minutes. If your knife doesn't allow you, after the 10th needle, to be carving that needle in 5 minutes, your knife is not up to a knife that should be considered the woodworking aspect of your survival kit. So, and then you drive your knife into a tree sufficiently that you can stand on the handle. And if you weigh 300 pounds, try to break the knife. If the knife doesn't break, well, why would I do that? Well, humanity, there's people that have sort of said that. Why would I do that? I'll use my knife. Well, you asked me to see how do you describe the durability of that knife? And God, He was, sort of say, that hole that's drilled there, which you stick the knife into a stick of the right kind, you make a notch, and then you stick a nail in there, and you can keep cutting short pieces of wood until the cows come home. And the last time I did a lot of that was I had the kids making whistles and recorders, and I would have to cut hundreds of plugs, because they got to pick the plugs and keep trying them until they fit perfectly. Because if they don't fit, if they are too small, they fall out. If they're too big, they crack the pipe, which is a fragile pipe made of copper stuff, and so on. Well, that's only the practical use for putting a nail in there. Oh, and people go up and, if you use the skin of moose, you're going to get hysteria. Well, everybody comes. But people says, hanging your knife around the neck, you're going to one day hang yourself. Well,
sure hasn't happened yet, has it?
Yeah. Maybe it happens once in 30 years, but that's not my concern. There's other reasons why I have the knife around my neck. And, one reason is anybody that wears a knife around their neck might have a connection with me, because they pick up why do you do that? Well, I picked it up from these nurses. There was a survival episode where I ended up teaching 600 nurses, and they all seemed to be carrying their scissors and their knives around their neck. And so I said, well, what? Well, they said the native people we know don't have belts, and they tend to carry their knives, so they sort of naturally, since they're kind of like, good people to emulate, so they carry out. So I adopted, and I said, I did some filming once, 3 days of filming. And as we review the filming, everything I do, I take my knife out of here, do my stuff, and I go there. instead of going here, the film crew who are watching, somebody said, you probably saved an hour each day. The fact that your knife was around your neck, and you're not searching for your sheath down here. And the other thing is, if your sheath is here, you're not as conscious as its presence here. So you're less apt to lose it. And then the Camping Club of America, or a prestigious group in the East, they happen to have a habit of carrying their knives. And some people said, oh, you must have got that from the Camping Club of America, whatever the title is. They even had their own flag. And I said, oh, did you get that there? And I wasn't aware. They told me I could have lied and said, yeah, I got it. So the issue comes from two directions, therefore. They're good. It's like no one dies of cayenne. No one dies of cardiac disease in Sichuan province because they consume so much cayenne pepper. And
Can you end it with something like, "That's my thoughts on what a knife should be built off," or something like that? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, I tell people, I say, look at that. Take a picture of it. If you're wondering, compare this configuration, which is sharp corners on the back, scanty grind, continuous curvature. Ignore the hole. You got holes in the handle. I hadn't seen Rod Garcia. I was going to suggest, why are you making rivets when maybe you put 3 holes to take the rivets? Well, there's 3 rivets. Well, 3 holes instead of making so many holes. So putting the brass liner in there and the epoxy is sufficient to keep and then he etches MK on the knife. That means Morris Kochanski. That he's got inside of a Roycroft back frame etched on there, and then he says MK. So the skookum, and it made quite a sensation when it came, out in the public, and a lot of people figured I designed it. But I said no. Rod would keep coming on the courses, and each time he brought a prototype, and then I saw the prototype. Rod has got the professional equipment to make a knife that way. Rod was a house painter who's married to a lady who made a very good living, so he became the housewife, and then he came up. I don't know how he came up with the idea to become a knife maker, but he happened to ask my opinion, and he came up with this. And I said, without Rod doing that, I wouldn't. I never sat down on a drafting table and drafted a knife, and I said, Rod, make this knife. No, he kept bringing knife and asked, what do you think? What do you think? So the end result there. And it just happened that my notoriety and my insights. I had a knife chapter in Bushcraft, which I published 32 years ago. And when that book got into the hands of the most eminent survival instructor in Finland, Turku Aaltonen, who I met in the conference that Lars was involved in 1995. But before that, when my book came out, Turku phoned me and said, I must talk to the person that has such a good knife chapter, because I have not seen in the English language anyone that devoted, and yet on the internet there was people that, 23 pages on knives, I could live without daggers. Well, I stopped reading on the internet because there were assholes that would rile me on account of their lack of insight. This one guy, he figured, you don't need any knife training. We can just pick it up naturally. Well, when I was dealing with the thousands of students, I saw a lot of blood, and I felt like I don't want to defend myself from an idiot, so why should I answer? I didn't bother. It'll take care of itself.
That's perfect. Okay, I'm going to end it at that because I have to cut this off anyway because it's almost at 30 minutes. That was perfect.